The wind carried a strange stillness that morning, the kind that made a man pause in his steps before he even knew why. He had ridden out early, hoping to check the far pasture before the sun climbed too high. His horse moved slow through the dew-soaked grass, ears flicking back and forth as if listening to something he could not hear. He sensed it too, a quiet tension settled over the land like a thin layer of frost. Nothing looked out of place, yet everything felt different. That uneasy feeling pressed on him harder with each passing stride, urging him on toward the old shed near the creek. He had not used that shed in months, but something tugged him there, a pull he couldn't explain. As he approached, his horse stopped on its own, refusing to go farther. The man frowned, sliding down from the saddle. The shed door hung slightly open, swaying just enough to catch the light. He pushed it wider, expecting maybe a stray calf or a raccoon that had slipped inside. What he found instead halted his breath. In the dim corner, bundled beneath an old quilt, lay a weak mare curled into herself as though trying to disappear. Her sides quivered with every shallow breath. Her coat was dusty and tangled, her legs folded stiffly beneath her. She lifted her head only an inch when he stepped forward, her eyes dull but pleading. He knelt slowly, afraid any sudden move might frighten her more. The quilt she lay on was out of place, too. It wasn't from his home, and it didn't match any of his belongings. Carefully, he lifted one corner of it, searching for injuries or wounds, but instead his fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. It was tucked beneath the edge as if someone wanted to make sure he found it. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic, as though written in a rush. His heart thudded as he read the few words written across it. Even though the message was short, it sent a cold shiver through him. Someone planned to take her next. That was all it said, yet it was enough to make the morning feel darker. He looked back at the mare, wondering who could have left her here. The shed was out of sight from the main road, hidden by trees. Whoever brought her must have known the property well enough to slip in undetected. He studied her face, hoping for some clue about where she came from. She wasn't a horse he recognized. Her build was lean, with a narrow blaze running down her face and a soft look in her eyes that hinted she was used to gentler handling than this. Something about her seemed familiar, yet he couldn't place it. The mystery of her presence weighed on him, urging him to think of every rancher and rider he'd crossed paths with recently. Outside, the air seemed to shift again, as if watching him. He led his horse closer, letting it stand guard near the doorway while he checked the mare's breathing. She needed water, maybe more than that, but the note gnawed at him. The words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. Someone meant to come back for her. Someone dangerous enough that the person who left her behind had felt fear pressing them into haste. He reread the message, hoping he had misunderstood, but the meaning stayed sharp as a blade. The mare had been taken before, and someone intended to take her again. The man knew he couldn't leave her as she was. He slid his arms beneath her neck, trying to help her sit upright. She leaned into him weakly, trusting him without hesitation. That trust only deepened the weight in his chest. Horses didn't give their trust easily, not without reason. Had she been waiting for someone like him all along? Or had she simply spent too long with people who treated her poorly? He steadied her, whispering softly as he ran his hand down her neck. She trembled at first, but soon her breathing evened a little. He stepped outside to fetch water from the trough near the fence. The air smelled wrong, like it carried someone else's scent. He glanced around the yard, noticing faint hoof prints that didn't belong to any of his animals. They led from the back road through the trees and ended near the shed. There were boot prints, too, smaller than his, pressed deep into the dirt as though the person had been hurrying. Whoever left the mare here wasn't strong enough to move her easily. He followed the prints a few steps, studying their pattern. The tracks stopped just beyond the fence line, as if the person had quickly mounted a horse and ridden off. He returned to the shed with the water, but his mind raced. Why leave the mare here? Why leave a note instead of asking for help? And why say someone planned to take her next? Was she part of something bigger, something he had unknowingly stepped into? He didn't want trouble, not the kind that came sneaking in during the night. Yet here it was, wrapped in a quilt and lying helpless on his property. He gently coaxed the mare to drink. She managed only a few sips before her head drooped again. He brushed her mane aside, noticing marks along her neck that didn't look accidental. They weren't from ropes or branches. They looked more like someone had tried to control her by force. His stomach tightened at the thought. If someone treated her so harshly, then the warning in the note wasn't just a worry. It was a promise that whoever had done this wasn't finished. He stepped away, letting the mare rest while he paced the ground outside. The sound of his horse shifting behind him kept him grounded, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. He didn't know who to trust with this information. If word spread too quickly, the wrong people might hear. He didn't want to put the mare in more danger. Yet if he stayed silent, he risked facing whoever was coming alone. For a moment he considered taking her straight to the nearest rancher he trusted, but she was too weak to travel. And he couldn't risk leading danger right to someone else's door. The safest place she had was here, hidden away, but only if he moved quickly and prepared for whatever might come next. He returned inside the shed, adjusting the quilt around the mare. Her ears twitched when he knelt beside her again. Even weak as she was, she seemed to understand he wasn't going to leave her. He set the note aside, but kept it close enough to reread if he needed. He wished it said more, wished it explained what was happening, but the few words written were all he had. It was enough to unsettle him, but not enough to understand. The wind picked up outside, carrying the distant sound of a gate creaking. He froze, listening. His horse bristled, head turning toward the noise. Someone might have stepped onto his property. Or it could have been just the wind pushing at old hinges. But after finding the mare, he no longer trusted the calmness of the morning. He rose slowly, glancing once more at the mare before stepping toward the shed door. He didn't know what waited outside, a stranger, a friend, or the one who meant to take the mare next. Whatever it was, he knew the story wasn't just beginning. It was already unfolding, pulling him deeper into something he never expected. He reached the doorway, his hand hovering just above the frame as he looked out across the yard. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows that stretched toward him like warnings etched on the ground. Something moved beyond the barn, slow and deliberate, just enough to tell him he wasn't alone anymore. And then, before he could call out or step back inside, he heard another sound, soft but unmistakable, rising from the trees behind the shed. It made his pulse jump and his breath catch. He turned toward it, eyes narrowing. Someone else was out there, watching, waiting, and they were closer than he thought. He stayed crouched beside the mare for a long moment, steadying his breath as the weight of the note pressed against his palm. The quiet inside the barn felt deeper now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Dust drifted through thin beams of light, settling over the mare's tangled mane and the wrinkled quilt that still clung to her back. She blinked slowly, her ribs rising and falling with a weak rhythm, and he felt an ache in his chest at how close to giving up she looked. Whoever had left her here had known she was in danger. That much was clear. But there was something else in the air, a kind of watchful silence that made him rise to his feet and look toward the open doorway as if someone might be standing just beyond it. He stepped out into the yard and let the cool morning wind move across his face, carrying the smell of hay, creek water, and something faintly metallic that he could not place. The hills beyond the fence rolled gently toward the horizon, calm and harmless. Yet he could not shake the feeling that eyes might be somewhere in the distance. He kept the note beside him, unfolding it again and reading the uneven handwriting that warned someone planned to take the little mare next. The words were rushed, slanted, almost trembling, as if written by someone who had no time to explain anything more. He wanted answers, but the farm around him offered none. The only sound came from the wind chimes on the porch, tapping lightly against one another. He walked back inside the barn and checked the mare again, noticing now that the quilt had a faded design sewn into one corner. The thread had been stitched by hand. It looked like the kind of work done by someone older or someone who still put meaning into every small thing. He traced the edge of it with his fingers, then paused when he felt a tiny knot under the fabric, like something tucked into the corner. He lifted the quilt and found a small scrap of cloth tied neatly around a thin wooden token. The token had a burned mark on one side, a symbol he did not recognize. It looked like half of a circle with a narrow line cutting through it. He turned it over again, wondering if it was a maker's mark or something far more personal. The mare shifted weakly, her breath catching as if she wanted his attention, so he quickly set the token aside and knelt to check her hooves. One leg trembled when he touched it, and he could tell she had been walked far beyond her limit. Whoever brought her here had done so in a rush. He found a bucket, filled it, and brought it to her. She lowered her head slowly, drinking in small sips. Each quiet sound she made seemed to echo inside the barn. He stayed beside her, speaking softly as he brushed dirt from her coat. He kept his voice steady, though questions churned in his mind. Who had left her? Why the warning, and why bring her to him of all places? He had lived on this land long enough to know when something was out of place. Strange things rarely happened around here, and when they did, they usually carried a reason that revealed itself in time. But this felt different. It felt like a shadow from somewhere he could not see, trailing close behind someone who had risked much to keep this horse safe for one more night. As he worked, he remembered the faint clatter he had heard earlier when he first stepped outside. It came from beyond the tree line near the old path where travelers sometimes passed through. At the time, he had ignored it, thinking it was just a deer or a loose board in the fence. But now the memory tightened something inside his chest. Someone had been close enough to hear him come out of the house, close enough to leave quickly before he came around to the barn. He stepped outside again and scanned the tree line. The branches swayed naturally, but the feeling of being watched had not left him. He walked toward the fence, looking for any sign of recent movement. The dirt looked disturbed not by hooves or wheels, but by boots. A set of prints led toward the creek, shallow and angled, as if the person had been moving fast but trying not to leave a clear trail. He followed the prints for a short distance until they reached the water. From there, the trail disappeared into smooth pebbles. He crouched and dipped his hand into the creek. The water was cold and the flow carried small flecks of leaves. He looked up again toward the thicker part of the woods, but no movement stirred. Still, he could not ignore the sense that someone had stood here, watching the farm, watching him, maybe waiting to see what he would do with the mare. He returned to the barn with a heaviness that had not been there earlier. The mare lifted her head slightly when he came in. Her eyes followed him, gentle yet clouded with exhaustion. He placed fresh hay in front of her and checked the wound on her shoulder, a scrape that looked newer than the other marks. It had been cleaned quickly, not well, suggesting the person who helped her was in a hurry. He wondered if the note had been written in the dark, hands shaking, eyes checking over a shoulder with each letter. The idea unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He set the quilt aside carefully and picked up the small wooden token again, studying it in the dim light. It felt old, yet the burn mark looked recent, sharp at the edges. He thought about showing it to someone in town, maybe someone who read symbols or carvings, but he paused. If someone truly planned to take the mare, showing this around might bring the wrong attention. He slipped the token into his pocket. Then he stood still, listening. The barn creaked softly, but another sound rose beneath it. A faint rustle, not inside the barn but outside, near the outer wall. He held his breath, waiting. The sound came again, slow, careful, like a foot brushing through grass. He stepped toward the wall, every sense sharpened. The mare gave a soft whinny behind him, a weak sound that almost seemed like a warning. He placed one hand on the barn door, ready to swing it open and face whatever was out there. The quiet deepened until he could hear his own heartbeat. He pushed the door open, but the yard outside looked empty. The sunlight was still gentle, laid across the ground like a pale sheet. He stepped out with caution, scanning each corner of the yard. The wind chimes rang again, and for a moment he thought it was only the breeze. Then he noticed one chime still swaying long after the others had settled, as if something had brushed against it moments before. He walked to the porch and touched the chime. It was still warm, like a hand had grazed past it. His eyes moved to the path beyond the gate. Another set of faint boot prints marked the edge of the dust, heading toward the open road. Fresh ones. Someone had been here again. Someone close enough to reach the porch. He felt a chill run through him, not from fear alone, but from the growing sense that he was now part of something far larger than a lost or stolen horse. Whoever wanted the mare had not given up, and whoever had brought her to him had trusted him for a reason he had not yet learned. He looked back toward the barn, toward the quiet figure of the mare resting under the fading light. He knew she carried more than tired bones and hidden bruises. She carried a secret. One that someone was willing to chase through the night? He turned toward the darkening road, wondering how long he had before whoever left those prints returned not as a watcher, but as a hunter. The road stayed quiet that morning, but he kept his eyes fixed on it long after the wind had stopped moving the dust. It felt strange to stand there waiting for something he could not name. The mare's uneasy breaths carried soft reminders from the barn, pulling him back to the work that still needed doing. He finally turned away from the road, though not without one last look at the tracks fading slowly into the earth. Inside, the weak mare lifted her head again when he stepped in. She looked a little more awake than before, though her eyes still held that tired, glassy shine. He ran his hand down her neck and whispered something calming as he checked her coat for any hidden marks he might have missed earlier. She flinched when he reached her side, and he paused. His fingers ran over a spot that felt slightly swollen beneath the hair. A bruise, fresh enough that it carried heat. That heat made something inside him burn too. Whoever had handled her last hadn't been kind. She had been pushed, hurried, maybe cornered. He stepped back and breathed deeply to keep his thoughts from racing too fast. Anger wasn't going to help either of them. He needed a clear mind, especially now when the air felt thick with unspoken danger. He found a clean cloth and dampened it at the pump outside before returning to her side. As he worked, he spoke softly without thinking. He told her she was safe here for now. He told her she'd get stronger. He told her he would make sure nothing happened to her until he figured out who was behind all this. The mare didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone, and she lowered her head against his shoulder just long enough for him to feel a quiet trust forming between them. He didn't know why it mattered so much already, but it did. While he tended to her, his mind drifted back to the wooden token still in his pocket. That burned symbol felt like the center of something he didn't yet understand. He wiped his hands on his trousers and pulled the token out again. Even in the dim light, the carved half-circle with its thin strike looked sharp. Too deliberate to be random, too clean to be old. He ran his thumb over it and felt a strange unease settle into his stomach. He locked the barn doors just as the sun climbed higher. Then he walked toward the shed near the back of the property where he kept his tools and spare supplies. The place smelled of sawdust and oil, familiar enough to settle his nerves. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small box filled with old keepsakes he never had the heart to throw away. Inside were small things collected over the years, pieces of woodwork, charms from travelers, metal scraps that once belonged to equipment long gone. As he sorted through them, he wondered if any marked symbol resembled the token's shape. Nothing came close? He set it aside and leaned back, feeling the unease deepen. If he was going to make sense of it, he'd need to talk to someone who knew more about marks and messages. But the thought of involving anyone in town made him hesitate. If someone truly dangerous wanted the mare, going into town unprepared could make him an easy target. Worse, it could draw the wrong eyes straight to her. Still, keeping everything to himself didn't feel safe either. He couldn't protect her alone if this situation grew bigger, and it already felt like it would. The footprints proved someone had been close enough to touch the porch, someone bold, someone who didn't mind being seen. He checked the barns and sheds one more time, making note of anything that felt out of place. A latch slightly bent, a loose board behind the tool shed, a faint boot print in the dirt near the grain bins. Signs that someone had moved quietly through the yard before dawn. The more he looked, the clearer it became. Whoever had come through here wasn't wandering. They were checking the property, watching. The mare wasn't just a stolen horse or a runaway. She was something else. Something valuable enough to make people follow her even to remote places like his farm? That thought stayed with him as he prepared a small feed mix for her, adding a bit of crushed oats for strength. When he returned to the barn, her ears twitched at the sound of approaching steps, and he could tell she was already growing familiar with his presence. She ate quietly while he checked her hooves again. Her legs still trembled when she shifted her weight, but she was standing stronger than before. The quilt lay folded near the stall door, its faded stitching carrying an unspoken story he wished he knew more about. He examined the knotted corner again, hoping for another hidden clue, only plain fabric. but the neatness of the stitches suggested care. Someone had protected her, not abandoned her. Whoever left her here must have known he would find her and take her in. The thought made him wonder who might trust him enough for that, or who might be desperate enough to choose the first safe place they stumbled upon. He stepped outside for a breath, letting the breeze pull his thoughts into calmer order. The mountains in the distance looked peaceful, their shadows stretching across fields that never asked for much attention. Yet the quiet no longer brought comfort. It felt too fragile, like a thin sheet hiding something unsettling beneath it. As he stood there, he noticed something near the fence line he had overlooked earlier. A thin strip of cloth caught on a nail, fluttering in the soft wind. He approached it slowly, aware that anything left behind could be connected to whoever had been creeping around his yard. The cloth was dark brown, torn at the edges, and smelled faintly of smoke and sweat. Not from the mare, it was from someone else, someone who had been close, someone who left in a hurry. He turned the cloth over in his hand. It was part of a sleeve. A heavy fabric, the kind worn by people who spent long hours traveling dusty roads or working out in rough country. The tear wasn't clean. It looked like it had been ripped from a jacket during a struggle or a fast escape. A fresh spike of worry rose inside him. Was the mare's previous handler chased? Were they hurt? Or did the cloth belong to the one who had followed her here? He walked back to the barn, the cloth still in his hand. The mare raised her head when he came in, as if sensing the shift in his mood. He approached her and let her sniff the cloth. She backed away quickly, ears flicking with unease. The reaction hit him harder than he expected. She was afraid of whoever this cloth belonged to. That told him enough. Whoever tore this and left it behind was the same person she feared the most. And that meant the visit to his porch wasn't from a friend. The tension in the air thickened as he folded the cloth and tucked it into his pocket next to the wooden token. 2 clues now, 2 pieces of a puzzle he didn't want but couldn't ignore. He spent the next few hours making sure the barn was as secure as he could manage, reinforced latches, extra boards over weak spots, tools placed where he could reach them fast. He wasn't preparing for a fight, but for the possibility that someone might return before he had answers. Toward late afternoon, clouds gathered over the hills, dimming the light across the farm. The air grew cooler, heavy with the hint of coming rain. He walked along the fence line again, scanning for any new signs of movement. Every sound felt sharper now, every rustle carried a question. A crow landed on the fence post and gave a raw call that echoed across the field, stirring an uneasy feeling inside him. He tried to focus on the practical work ahead, but his mind kept circling back to the warning note, the bruises on the mare, the prints by the creek, the warm chime, the torn cloth. Each piece pointed toward a threat, closing in little by little, yet none of them revealed the heart of the danger. By evening, the first drops of rain began to fall. He hurried back to the barn to check on the mare one last time. She was standing, head lowered, eyes calm but watchful. He stroked her neck gently and stayed by her until the rain grew heavier outside. As he reached for the lantern, he paused. A new sound drifted through the barn boards, not rain, not wind. A slow crunch of footsteps approaching the yard. Someone was out there? Again? He held the lantern close, every sense locked on that steady rhythm of steps moving through wet grass. The mare shifted uneasily, picking up the same danger he felt. The steps stopped just beyond the barn door. A brief silence followed, heavy and expectant. He knew without a doubt that whoever stood outside had come for the mare, and this time they weren't just watching. They were close enough to reach for the latch. The rain fell harder, masking everything except the pounding of his own heart as he stepped toward the door, unsure if he would be ready for what waited on the other side. Rain hammered the roof like a steady warning as he stood frozen behind the barn door. The lantern flame wavered in his grip, throwing small, jittery shadows across the wooden walls. He listened again, trying to make sense of the faint presence just outside. The mare shifted behind him, hooves scraping lightly against the floor, her breath coming quicker now. She felt the danger before he even moved. Another step sounded outside, slow and deliberate, as if the person wanted him to know they were right there. He tightened his hold on the door but didn't open it. Instead, He leaned close and tried to look through the small gap between the boards. The rain made it hard to see anything clearly, turning the yard into a blur of dark shapes and moving water. But one thing stood out, a figure, tall enough for its shadow to stretch faintly across the ground. His chest tightened. Whoever had been prowling around before had now returned with purpose. No more careful scouting, no more quiet steps. This time they walked straight to the barn with confidence, as if they already knew he wouldn't surrender the mare without a challenge. He stepped back from the door, knowing he needed to think fast. If he stayed inside, the intruder could corner him. If he went outside, he risked stepping right into danger. He looked at the mare, who trembled but kept her eyes fixed on him. She trusted him now, more than she trusted the world outside that door. He took a breath, steadying himself, and set the lantern on a hook near her stall. The dim light was enough to see, but not bright enough to give away his every move. The footsteps faded for a moment, replaced by the hiss of rain pouring off the barn roof. Then the barn latch rattled. A slow test, a warning, someone was checking the lock. Someone who believed it might open if they kept trying. He reached for the closest tool he could find, which happened to be a broken wooden handle, smooth and worn from old use. Not much, but better than standing empty-handed. He tried to calm his breathing, telling himself that whoever stood outside didn't know how ready or unready he was. Sometimes fear worked both ways. Sometimes the person outside the door was as uncertain as the one inside. The latch rattled again. Harder this time. He tightened his grip on the handle and stepped closer, his boots soundless on the dirt floor. Every small movement seemed painfully loud to his own ears. The mare exhaled sharply, her body tense. He reached out and brushed his hand against her shoulder to calm her again. She pressed her head against him for a brief moment, grounding them both. Suddenly the rattling stopped. Silence pressed against the walls, so thick it felt heavier than the storm itself. He strained to hear anything familiar, but the world outside gave nothing. Just rain, wind, and a sense that someone stood waiting, watching, planning their next move. Then came a different sound. A small scrape, faint but unmistakable. Someone was circling the barn. He moved to the other side and looked between the boards again. He caught a glimpse of movement near the fence line, but it was too dark to make out details. Whoever it was must have realized the door wouldn't give easily, so they were looking for another way in. Maybe a weak board or an unlatched window. He cursed himself under his breath, remembering the broken slat near the back wall he had planned to fix but hadn't gotten to yet. He hurried across the barn and knelt to check it. The wood was still intact, but the rain-softened ground around it showed fresh impressions. Someone had already been here earlier, checking the weak spot. If they remembered it now, they might try to pry it open. He stood again and pressed his back to the wall, trying to figure out how much longer he could keep the mare safe. He had no neighbors close enough to hear him shout. No help coming down the road, no sign the storm would end any time soon. He was on his own, with only a weakened horse and a few old tools between him and whoever hunted her. The next sound made him jump. A sudden thud against the barn boards, strong enough to shake dust from the rafters. He stepped away from the wall, heart pounding. Another thud followed, then another. Someone was using their shoulder, trying to break a weak panel open by force. He rushed to the mare's stall and unlatched the inner door, guiding her toward the far corner where the shadows were deeper. She resisted at first, shaky on her legs, but followed when he placed one steadying hand on her neck. He whispered to her again, promising she wasn't alone. Her breath brushed against his arm in trembling waves. The pounding on the wall stopped as suddenly as it began. That silence returned. But this time it felt sharper, like the air held its breath. Then a voice broke through the storm. "Open the door." A low command, not shouted, not rushed. Firm, steady, and too calm for the chaos outside. He felt the mare stiffen. She recognized the voice. Her fear climbed instantly, proving she knew this person, knew them well enough to dread them. He didn't answer, he didn't dare. "I know she's in there," the voice continued. "And I'm not leaving without her." He swallowed hard, trying to decide if he should keep quiet, negotiate, or prepare to run. The voice didn't belong to a stranger who was guessing. This was someone who had followed the mare long before she reached his porch. Someone who must have chased her across miles to reach this isolated place. Someone who would cross any boundary to claim her again. He stepped closer to the door, though he still didn't open it. He had to know more. "Why do you want her?" he asked quietly, keeping his tone steady. "What harm could she possibly cause?" A soft laugh drifted back, almost drowned by the storm. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." Rain hammered the dirt harder, making the second stretch painfully long. "You have something that belongs to me," the stranger said. "She carries more than her weight. You'll hand her over, or I'll take her myself." He clenched his jaw. The answer wasn't good. It wasn't clear, but it was enough to confirm that this wasn't just about reclaiming a horse. Something else was tied to her. Something heavy enough to make someone travel through storms and shadows to retrieve her. A new sound echoed across the yard. Hoofbeats, fast ones, more than one horse. He felt the weight of those hits through the ground beneath him. The stranger wasn't alone. They had brought a group? Panic flared in his chest. He moved quickly to the back corner, guiding the mare deeper into the shadows. Her legs trembled, but she followed, trusting him. The hoofbeats slowed outside the barn, turning the yard into a ring of unseen riders. He could almost hear the horses snorting through the rain. A faint clang of metal suggested someone adjusting a stirrup or checking equipment. This wasn't a simple visit from one determined person. This was a coordinated effort. They planned this. They came prepared. He backed away from the door again and scanned the barn, trying to find any path of escape. The small back window was too narrow for the mare. The side door was old and open toward the yard, where the riders waited. The storm outside would slow them, but wouldn't stop them. His mind raced. He wished he had more time, more strength, more help. But the only thing he had now was determination. He wasn't giving her up to people who treated her like an object. Not while she looked at him with those desperate eyes. The voice outside spoke again, louder this time. "This is your last chance. Open the door and walk away while you still can." He stayed silent, gripping the wooden handle until his knuckles burned. The intruder exhaled sharply, fed up with the delay. "Fine." A single word, sharp as a blade. Then came a crack. A loud, splintering crack from the side of the barn. Someone had struck a weak section with something heavy. Another crack followed, harder. Wood snapped, bending inward slightly. Dust and stray straw drifted down from the rafters. They were breaking in. He moved in front of the mare, shielding her as best he could. Her trembling intensified, but she stayed behind him, trusting him completely now. He wished he could promise her safety with more confidence than he felt. Another blow shook the wall. The boards buckled. A faint streak of lantern light slipped through the new gap, highlighting the rain outside in the shape of a boot as someone pried at the broken panel. The storm raged louder. The gap widened. The strangers were seconds away from breaking through and facing him with whatever intentions they carried. He braced himself, uncertain if he'd be strong enough to stop them, but sure of one thing. He wouldn't let them take her without a fight. The wall gave one final groan as another heavy strike hit it. And with that shattering sound, the moment before the climax hung in the air, breathless and ready to break. The wall finally gave way with a crack that rang through the barn like a warning bell. Light from outside flashed through the opening for a heartbeat before the rain swept across the gap, turning the space into a blur of shifting shadows. He stepped back, pulling the mare with him, even though she could barely stand. Her legs shook and her breath came fast, but she kept her head close to his side, waiting for him to make the next move. The figure on the other side of the broken wall pushed at the board again, trying to widen the opening. But before the stranger could step through, thunder cracked and lightning filled the yard with a bright flash. For a moment, everything outside was clear. He saw the riders, 4 of them. Their coats plastered to their shoulders, hats dripping, horses restless under them. They didn't look confused or lost. They were here with purpose, surrounding the barn so nothing inside could escape. But something else caught his eye. One rider stayed behind the others, turning his horse in a slow circle as if scouting the area. That rider seemed nervous, glancing toward the hills more than toward the barn. It was a strange detail, but one that stuck in his mind. The rider at the broken panel leaned forward, ready to crawl inside. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the lantern from its hook, stepped toward the broken wall, and held the light up to the intruder's face. For the first time, he saw the man clearly. Cold eyes, a jaw tight with frustration. A face too familiar with intimidation. But when the lantern glow settled on him, he flinched and ducked back a little. Not from fear, but from being caught where he didn't expect resistance. "What do you think you're doing?" The man snapped. "Protecting what isn't yours," he answered. Before the intruder could retort, another voice rose above the storm. It came from the rider who had been circling the yard. Softer, but sharp enough to cut through the rain. "Leave him be, you've done enough." The intruder turned sharply. "Stay out of this." But the rider dismounted and walked toward the barn, boots splashing through puddles. The horse behind him snorted, uneasy. As he came closer, the man inside the barn watched carefully. There was something different about this newcomer. His posture lacked the hostility the others carried. Instead, he looked worn out, as if he had been fighting a battle of his own long before arriving here. The intruder turned to him. "Don't interfere. I didn't ride out in this storm to watch you hurt another animal," the newcomer said. "That mare didn't deserve what happened." "None of them did." The intruder's face twisted with annoyance. "She's valuable. She's worth more than you think. She's worth more than you deserve," the newcomer muttered. The tension between them thickened. He sensed this wasn't the first time the two had argued over something like this. There was history he didn't yet understand, but he didn't have time to untangle it. The stranger still wanted the mare, and his group still surrounded the barn. The newcomer stepped closer to the broken panel, but instead of threatening, he raised his voice so everyone outside could hear. "She's not coming with you. If she goes anywhere, it's to someone who'll treat her right." The intruder clenched his fists. "You don't get to choose. I'm choosing anyway." He turned and looked directly inside the barn, meeting the rancher's eyes for the first time. Rain dripped down his face, but he didn't blink. "She ran from him," the newcomer explained. "He overworked his animals, used them harder than anyone should, and when they broke, he traded them off like they were nothing. The mare only escaped because she was desperate. She'd collapse before letting him catch her again." The rancher glanced back at the mare. Her shaking had worsened, and her eyes darted between the men outside as if she feared being recognized. She leaned against him again, trembling. The intruder snapped, "Enough." "Move aside." "I won't," the newcomer said firmly. The standoff thickened until even the rain seemed to hold its breath. The rancher braced himself for the worst. He tightened his grip on the broken wood handle and kept himself in front of the mare. But then one of the other riders spoke up from the left side of the yard. His voice wasn't aggressive, just tired. "Let her go. This is too much trouble for one sick horse." The intruder spun around. "Are you turning on me too?" Another rider chimed in, shrugging. "Storm's getting worse. We could be here all night." "Not worth it." The intruder threw his hands up in frustration. "You're all useless." The newcomer folded his arms. "Maybe, but we're not cruel." The leader glared at each of them, eyes burning with anger that flickered between betrayal and disbelief. For a moment, the rancher thought the man might lash out, but instead the intruder yanked his coat straight, spat into the mud, and barked an order. "We're leaving." The riders hesitated, then tugged their reins and backed their horses away from the barn. The intruder mounted his own horse with a sharp motion and glared one last time toward the broken panel. "This isn't over," he growled. "It is for me," the newcomer replied. With a wave of his hand, the intruder led his group through the storm, hooves splashing through puddles as they disappeared into the darkness. The rancher waited, holding his breath until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he lower the wooden handle and take a shaky step toward the broken wall. Rain dripped through the gap, wetting the barn floor. The threat outside had vanished, but he still felt the weight of everything. The newcomer remained where he stood, staring into the barn with an expression that mixed exhaustion, regret, and relief. "You all right in there?" he asked. The rancher nodded slowly. "Thanks to you," the man exhaled heavily. "I'm sorry you got caught in the middle. I should have stopped him sooner. I didn't know he'd chase her this far." The rancher reached back and touched the mare's neck again. She leaned into him. "She's safe now," he said softly. The newcomer nodded. "If you're willing, she stays safe with you." She needs time, rest, kindness. The rancher looked at the mare again. Even in her weak state, she had a quiet beauty, strong spirit, gentle eyes. She had trusted him from the moment he found her under that quilt. And now, seeing the fear she had for the intruder, he understood that trust fully. She can stay, he said. The newcomer's shoulders loosened in relief. Good, she deserves a new start. He stepped back into the rain. I'll head out before the storm gets worse. But if you ever need anything, I'm not far from here. The rancher nodded gratefully. Thank you. As the man walked away, leading his horse through the mud, the rancher turned back to the mare. He guided her farther into the barn where the ground was dry and the air warmer. She lowered her head, breathing easier now that the danger had passed. He patched the broken wall as best he could, nailing the boards back into place and draping a tarp over the gap to keep the rain out. By the time he finished, the storm had weakened, turning into a steady drizzle. He walked back to the mare and sat beside her while she rested. Her breathing slowed. The fear faded from her eyes. She watched him with a calmness that told him she finally understood she wasn't going anywhere she didn't want to go. Morning came quietly. Soft light filled the barn, and the smell of wet earth hinted at a peaceful day ahead. The mare stood on steadier legs now, nudging him gently as if asking for reassurance. He ran his hand along her neck, feeling the warmth return to her body. He stepped outside and saw the storm clouds drifting away over the hills. The muddy tracks left by the intruders already softened under the morning sun. The night had been long and heavy, but dawn always brought clarity. He turned back to the mare with a small smile. You're staying here, he said. No one's taking you again. A faint whinny escaped her throat, soft but hopeful. He opened the barn door wider, letting the fresh air roll in. The world felt different now, safer, brighter, the kind of day worth building something new on. The mare stepped forward, nudging his shoulder again as if agreeing. He didn't know what challenges might come next or whether the intruder might return someday, but he knew one thing for certain. He would protect her. Not because she was valuable, not because she carried some secret, but because she deserved peace after everything she had endured. And in giving her that peace, he found something meaningful for himself too. The barn that once held only tools and hay now held purpose, warmth, life. He glanced at the rising sun and took a deep breath. The long night was over, the mare was safe. And for the first time in a long while, the ranch felt like a place where something good could grow again.